Every government tells you that wars are fought for freedom, democracy, national security, or some other noble cause that justifies the sacrifice of blood and treasure. They show you the soldiers, the equipment, and the strategic objectives. What they don't show you is the ledger, the financial machinery that actually makes war possible. Because modern wars aren't fought with courage and strategy alone. They're fought with borrowed money, printed currency, and hidden taxes that ordinary people pay long after the shooting stops. The tanks, planes, and missiles you see on the news all have price tags measured in billions. The soldiers need to be paid, fed, and equipped. And someone, somewhere, is writing checks, or more accurately, creating money from nothing to fund the carnage while collecting interest on humanity's most destructive enterprise. Understanding how wars are really financed means looking past the patriotic rhetoric and strategic justifications to see the uncomfortable economic truth. War is expensive beyond anything most people can comprehend. And the methods used to pay for it, whether taxation that strips citizens of wealth, borrowing that enslaves future generations to debt, or money printing that silently steals purchasing power through inflation, all represent massive transfers of resources from ordinary people to the state, the military-industrial complex, and the financial institutions that profit from conflict. The real cost of war isn't just measured in lives lost on battlefields, it's measured in economic bondage imposed on everyone else. There are fundamentally three ways to finance war, and every conflict in history has used some combination of them. The first and most honest is direct taxation, where governments simply take money from their citizens to pay for military operations. The second is borrowing, where governments issue bonds or take loans that will be repaid eventually, shifting costs to future taxpayers. And the third is money creation, either through currency debasement in ancient times or central bank money printing today, which is really just a hidden tax through inflation. Each method has different political costs, different economic consequences, and different distributions of who benefits and who suffers. But they all share one feature: ordinary people pay while political leaders, military contractors, and financiers profit. The oldest method of war finance wasn't any of these. It was plunder. Ancient armies financed themselves by stealing from the territories they conquered. Roman legions expected to be paid partly through shares of captured loot. Viking raiders financed expeditions through the wealth they could seize. Mongol hordes sustained themselves on plundered grain and livestock. This system had brutal simplicity. The conquered paid for their own subjugation. But plunder only works if you're winning. If there's territory to conquer and wealth to steal, it fails completely in defensive wars or stalemates. And it requires defeating enemies before running out of supplies, which meant ancient wars tended to be short, decisive affairs, or turned into drawn-out sieges where both sides slowly starved. As states became more centralized and wars grew larger, plunder became insufficient. Medieval European monarchs financed wars through a combination of their own feudal revenues, essentially the agricultural output from lands they personally owned, and special taxes levied on nobles and commoners. The English Parliament emerged from kings needing approval to raise war taxes from the commons, people without noble titles who nonetheless had wealth that kings wanted. This created an early form of accountability. Kings couldn't simply take money for wars. They had to convince Parliament that the war was necessary and the taxes justified. Refusal to grant taxes could force kings to abandon wars or seek alternative financing, which usually meant borrowing from bankers at high interest rates. The development of war bonds and government borrowing transformed war finance fundamentally. Instead of needing to extract wealth immediately through taxation, governments could borrow against future revenues, spreading the cost over years or even generations. The American Revolution was financed substantially through loans from French and Dutch bankers who bet on American victory. Continental Congress issued currency and domestic bonds, but these were often worthless or heavily discounted because the Congress lacked taxing authority to guarantee repayment. Individual states borrowed as well, and many Revolutionary War soldiers borrowed against their farms to equip themselves. Debts that contributed to Shays' Rebellion in 1786 when indebted veterans rebelled against debt collection. The Civil War marked a turning point in American war finance and demonstrated all three methods of financing simultaneously. The Union raised taxes significantly, implementing the first federal income tax and increasing tariffs and excise taxes. It also borrowed massively, selling bonds to citizens through marketing campaigns that appealed to patriotism and profit motive. And crucially, it printed money, issuing greenbacks, paper currency not backed by gold or silver but by government decree. The Confederacy relied more heavily on printing money and borrowing, issuing large quantities of currency and bonds. When the Confederacy lost, its bonds and currency became worthless, and the 14th Amendment explicitly repudiated Confederate war debts, one of the largest sovereign defaults in history. But it was World War I that established the template for modern war finance, combining taxation, borrowing, and money creation on scales never before attempted. Britain, France, and Germany all issued war bonds to their citizens, mounting massive propaganda campaigns to convince people that lending to government was patriotic duty. In Austria-Hungary, the first war loan in November 1914 had a repayment period of just a few years, but by the eighth and final loan in 1918, the repayment extended from 1924 to 1958, meaning debts incurred during World War I would theoretically have been serviced into the period after World War II. The scale of borrowing was astronomical. The United States entered the war relatively late, but still borrowed over $30 billion, selling Liberty bonds to American citizens through campaigns that made buying bonds a test of patriotism and masculinity. Posters showed soldiers asking, "Are you buying your share?" and women reminding men that failure to buy bonds was cowardice. But bonds alone couldn't finance the war's true costs. Governments needed immediate money, not promises of future funds. So they borrowed directly from central banks, which created money to purchase government bonds. In Germany and Austria-Hungary, roughly 60% of war costs came from war loans sold to citizens and institutions, and 40% came from borrowing directly from central banks. This direct central bank borrowing was inflationary by design. It increased the money supply without increasing productive capacity, meaning more money chasing fewer goods as resources were diverted to war production. The consequence was inflation that effectively taxed everyone holding currency, reducing their purchasing power to finance government spending. The mechanism was even more insidious in Austria-Hungary, where war loans were issued as Lombard credits by the Austro-Hungarian Bank, further increasing the money in circulation. Citizens would buy war bonds, pledging their savings. The central bank would then loan money to those citizens using the bonds as collateral, meaning the money spent on bonds immediately returned to circulation rather than being withdrawn from the economy. The bonds did nothing to reduce inflationary pressure. They were just a mechanism for creating more money while giving the appearance of responsible borrowing. And when the war ended with Austria-Hungary's defeat and dissolution, the bonds became worthless, destroying the savings of everyone who'd been convinced to lend to a government that would cease to exist. Who subscribed to these war loans reveals the coercive nature of war finance. With early loans, private citizens contributed substantial sums, driven by patriotism and genuine belief in victory. But as wars dragged on and victory seemed uncertain, private subscriptions declined. Institutional subscribers, banks, insurance companies, and industrial enterprises had to step in, essentially forced by governments to purchase bonds. In Austria-Hungary, the German-speaking regions subscribed more than Czech regions, reflecting ethnic divisions that would tear the empire apart. Banks would extend credit to customers specifically to purchase war bonds, creating circular financing where the banking system created money to purchase government debt. This pattern appeared in every belligerent nation. Citizens who couldn't afford bonds would borrow from banks to buy them, going into personal debt to finance government debt. World War II perfected this financial machinery. The United States spent over $300 billion fighting the Axis powers, equivalent to roughly $4.7 trillion today, about 40% of GDP at the war's peak. This was financed through a carefully orchestrated combination of taxation, borrowing, and money creation designed to maximize revenue while controlling inflation. About one-third came from increased taxes, including raising top marginal income tax rates to 94% for the wealthiest Americans. Another third came from selling war bonds, Series E, F, and G bonds marketed to citizens as both patriotic duty and sound investment. The final third came from Federal Reserve management of the money supply, essentially creating money to purchase government bonds while using reserve requirements and other tools to control how much banks could lend. The bonds were crucial not primarily for the money they raised, but for their role in controlling inflation. By selling bonds to citizens, the government pulled money out of circulation that otherwise would have chased scarce consumer goods, driving prices higher. Workers in war industries were earning good wages, but rationing and conversion of consumer industries to war production meant there was little to buy. War bonds soaked up that excess purchasing power, preventing inflation from spiraling while giving citizens paper promises that would be redeemed years later. It was financially sophisticated, economically effective, and quietly coercive. Not buying war bonds was portrayed as unpatriotic, even treasonous. Social pressure, propaganda, and outright shaming convinced millions to lend to government at relatively low interest rates, rates that didn't compensate for inflation that occurred during and after the war. The private sector purchased more than 87% of marketable debt sold from 1940 into 45, with commercial banks absorbing 31% of that total. Banks didn't do this from patriotism, but from profit and coercion. The Federal Reserve set interest rates artificially low and provided preferential lending to banks that bought government bonds. Banks could borrow from the Fed at low rates, purchase higher-yielding government bonds, and profit from the spread while claiming to support the war effort. And when the war ended, banks held enormous quantities of government debt, giving them leverage over post-war economic policy. Any government actions that threatened bond values would hurt banks, creating alignment between banking interests and government fiscal policy that persists today. Germany financed its war effort primarily through borrowing and money creation, selling war bonds called Kriegsanleihe to citizens through massive drives. The Nazi regime conducted multiple bond campaigns using propaganda, social pressure, and outright threats to force citizens to buy bonds. But Germany also printed money directly, expanding the currency supplied to pay for military operations. This was concealed initially through accounting tricks and suppressed price controls, but the inflationary pressure was building. When Germany lost and the regime collapsed, the Reichsmark became nearly worthless, destroying the savings of everyone who'd held German currency or bonds. The pattern repeats in every losing nation. War finance through borrowing and money creation transfers risk from government to citizens. If the government wins, it can service debts through reparations or economic growth. If it loses, citizens who lent to government or held its currency lose everything. The post-World War II era saw two innovations in war finance that fundamentally changed how conflicts were funded. The first was the permanent military establishment justified by the Cold War. Prior to World War II, American defense spending would spike during wars and decline to minimal levels during peace. But after 1945, defense spending remained elevated even without active combat, justified by the need to deter Soviet aggression. This created a permanent constituency of military contractors, bases, and communities dependent on defense spending, making it politically difficult to reduce even when threats diminished. Defense spending became baked into the budget, a permanent claim on resources that didn't require special wartime taxation or borrowing. The second innovation was off-budget war funding through emergency supplemental appropriations. Prior to 9/11, U.S. wars were financed through a mixture of higher taxes, budget cuts, and funding mostly through the regular defense budget. 1/3 of the costs of World War I and half the costs of World War II were met through higher taxes. But the post-9/11 wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere were financed almost entirely through borrowing, with no tax increases and actually tax cuts during wartime. Instead of including war costs in the regular defense budget, they were funded through emergency supplemental appropriations, separate legislation that didn't count against budget caps and wasn't subject to the same scrutiny. This created what some researchers call the ghost budget, the biggest budgetary anomaly in U.S. history. The post-9/11 wars from 2001 to 2014 cost somewhere between $1.5 to $1.7 trillion in direct spending, not counting long-term costs like veterans' care and interest on debt incurred. None of this was paid for through taxation. It was all borrowed, added to the national debt with interest payments and eventual repayment left to future taxpayers. This is fundamentally different from how previous American wars were financed and represents a shift in political calculation. Leaders discovered they could wage wars without imposing the immediate costs on voters who might object. By borrowing instead of taxing, war costs became invisible in the present, appearing only as gradually accumulating debt that future generations would service. The true cost of the post-9/11 wars far exceeds the direct military spending. When you include veterans' care and disability for the next 40 years, interest on borrowed war funds, homeland security spending driven by the wars, and opportunity costs of investments not made because resources went to war, the total reaches over $8 trillion and counting. These costs will be paid through decades of tax revenues, meaning children not yet born will be paying for wars that ended before they were born. This intergenerational wealth transfer from future taxpayers to present military contractors, defense industries, and the financial institutions that finance the borrowing is rarely acknowledged in debates about whether wars were worth fighting. The mechanism of modern war finance is sophisticated enough that most people don't understand it and therefore can't object meaningfully. When the government borrows to finance wars, it issues treasury bonds. The Federal Reserve often purchases these bonds either directly or through secondary markets, creating money to do so. This expands the money supply, which eventually causes inflation if not offset by economic growth. But the inflation appears years later, seemingly disconnected from the war spending that caused it. Ordinary people see prices rising and blame corporate greed, supply chain disruptions, or foreign factors. They rarely connect inflation to deficit spending years earlier to finance military operations. The causal chain is too long and too technical for most people to follow, which makes it politically safe in ways direct taxation never could be. Banks and financial institutions profit at every stage of war finance. When governments borrow by issuing bonds, banks underwrite those issuances, collecting fees. They purchase bonds themselves, earning interest paid by taxpayers. They lend to defense contractors who build weapon systems, earning interest on those loans. They finance purchases by foreign governments buying American weapons, earning fees and interest. And when the Federal Reserve creates money to purchase government bonds, banks hold reserves at the Fed earning interest. The financial sector extracts profit from every transaction in the war finance chain while bearing virtually no risk because government debt is guaranteed by taxing authority and Federal Reserve support. Defense contractors similarly profit with minimal risk. Cost-plus contracts guarantee profits even if programs run over budget or behind schedule. And because defense spending is justified by national security, a nearly unchallengeable political priority, contractors face little pressure to control costs. The F-35 fighter jet program, for example, has cost over $1.7 trillion across its lifetime, making it the most expensive weapon system in history. Repeated delays, technical failures, and cost overruns haven't killed the program because the contractors, Lockheed Martin and its subcontractors, have spread production across nearly every congressional district, ensuring that cancellation would cost jobs in districts of powerful legislators who protect the program regardless of performance. This is how modern wars are really financed. Not through the honest mechanism of asking citizens to pay directly through taxes, which would force politicians to justify costs and citizens to weigh whether wars are worth the price. Instead, through hidden mechanisms, borrowing that shifts costs to people not yet born, money creation that manifests as inflation years later, and off-budget accounting that makes war costs disappear from fiscal calculations. The result is that political leaders can wage wars without bearing the political cost of financing them. Defense contractors can profit endlessly from conflicts that never quite end, and financial institutions can collect interest on the mounting debts while ordinary people ultimately pay through reduced purchasing power, higher taxes, and opportunity costs of resources diverted from productive investment to destructive war. The Vietnam War demonstrated the political consequences when war finance becomes visible. Initially financed through the same mechanisms as World War II with borrowing and Federal Reserve money creation, the war's costs eventually became apparent through inflation that reached double digits by the early 1970s. President Johnson refused to raise taxes to pay for the war, fearing political backlash would undermine his Great Society programs. So the war was financed through borrowing and money creation, creating inflationary pressure that destroyed the Bretton Woods system and led to the Nixon shock ending dollar-gold convertibility. The inflation caused by Vietnam War finance contributed to economic instability that lasted through the 1970s, demonstrating that hidden financing isn't truly hidden. The costs appear eventually, just in forms that are difficult to trace back to their sources. Compare this to how ancient and medieval wars were financed, and the difference is revealing. When wars required immediate taxation or plunder, they couldn't last indefinitely. Resources would run out, populations would rebel against excessive taxation, and wars would end either in victory, defeat, or exhausted stalemate. The need to finance wars immediately imposed natural limits on their duration and scope. But modern finance has removed those limits. Wars can continue indefinitely as long as governments can borrow or print money. The absence of immediate costs means the absence of immediate political consequences, which means wars can persist long after they've achieved or failed to achieve any meaningful objective. Afghanistan perfectly illustrates this dynamic. The war lasted 20 years, far longer than any previous American conflict, and cost over $2 trillion in direct spending plus trillions more in long-term obligations. Why did it last so long despite achieving little after the initial overthrow of the Taliban? Because it didn't impose visible costs on most Americans. It was fought by a small volunteer military, less than 1% of the population. It was financed entirely through borrowing, with no war taxes, and it was largely absent from media coverage after the first few years. Most Americans went about their lives with no awareness that the country was at war, let alone any sense of what that war cost. This disconnect between war fighting and war costs enabled the conflict to continue for 2 decades, despite lacking clear objectives or measures of success. The pattern extends beyond the United States. Every modern nation finances wars through similar mechanisms, borrowing from citizens and financial institutions while central banks provide monetary accommodation. Russia's war in Ukraine is being financed through central bank purchases of government debt and drawdowns of foreign currency reserves. Ukraine is being financed through international aid, mostly from the United States and European nations, aid that is itself borrowed and will eventually need to be repaid by taxpayers in donor countries. China's military buildup is financed through government debt purchases by state-controlled banks. The mechanisms vary in detail, but the principle is universal. Modern wars are financed through debt and money creation rather than direct taxation, socializing costs across populations and into the future while privatizing profits for contractors and financiers. The economic research on war finance confirms what intuition suggests. There's a strong connection between financing wars through taxation versus borrowing and political support for those wars. Leaders who raise taxes to pay for wars face punitive electoral consequences. Voters punish them for imposing visible costs. But leaders who finance wars through borrowing or money creation face fewer immediate consequences because the costs are hidden or delayed. This creates a perverse incentive structure where political leaders prefer economically worse financing methods, borrowing and inflation, because they're politically easier than economically better methods like direct taxation. Society as a whole would be better served by honest accounting and immediate taxation, forcing democratic deliberation about whether wars are worth their costs. But individual politicians are better served by hiding costs, allowing them to wage wars without bearing political consequences. The British practice of paying for supplies in gold sovereigns during the Napoleonic Wars, mentioned almost as a footnote in histories of war finance, reveals an important principle. Armies that pay for what they take earn cooperation from local populations. Armies that simply take what they need through requisition or plunder face resistance and sabotage. But modern war finance has reversed this logic. Today's wars are paid for by people far from the fighting, taxpayers and future generations who have no say in whether wars are fought or how they're conducted. The populations in war zones often receive nothing or worse than nothing, bearing the violence while resources flow from their countries to weapon manufacturers in distant nations. And the populations in countries waging wars are insulated from costs by finance mechanisms that hide the bill until long after the war ends. There's something fundamentally undemocratic about this system. In theory, democratic nations require public support for war embodied in congressional declarations or parliamentary votes. But if the public never sees or feels the costs, if wars are financed through methods that hide the price until decades later, can public consent be meaningful? The answer is no. Informed consent requires understanding consequences, including costs. When costs are hidden through complex financial mechanisms most people don't understand, consent is uninformed at best and manipulated at worst. The financial architecture of modern war has created a democracy deficit where the most important decision a nation makes, whether to go to war, is insulated from the democratic accountability it theoretically requires. And who benefits from this system? Certainly not the soldiers who fight or the civilians in war zones who suffer the violence, not taxpayers who ultimately fund wars through decades of debt service and inflation, not future generations saddled with debts from wars they didn't authorize. The beneficiaries are narrowly concentrated. Defense contractors who receive guaranteed profits from open-ended contracts. Financial institutions that earn interest on government borrowing. Politicians who can demonstrate decisiveness and strength without imposing immediate costs on voters. And the national security bureaucracy that justifies its existence and expanding budgets through perpetual conflict. These groups form an iron triangle of interests aligned around continued military spending financed through debt, a system that serves them brilliantly while serving the broader public poorly. Understanding how wars are really financed matters because it reveals the disconnect between war fighting and war costs, between the rhetoric of necessary conflict and the reality of who pays and who profits. Every time you hear politicians debate whether to intervene somewhere, whether to fund some military operation, whether to sustain defense spending at levels exceeding the next 10 nations combined, understand that the costs won't be paid today. They'll be borrowed, added to debt that earns interest for bondholders, serviced through future taxation, and manifested in inflation that erodes everyone's purchasing power. The true cost will appear years or decades later in forms that make it nearly impossible to trace back to the military spending that caused it. And that invisibility is the point. It's not a bug in the system, but its essential feature, enabling wars to be fought without the political costs that direct financing would impose. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History doesn't repeat, but the hidden costs always come due. And the next war, like everyone before it, will be paid for by people who never agreed to fight it, using money that doesn't exist yet, creating debts that won't be settled in your lifetime. That's not a consequence of how wars are financed. That's the entire point.